I never believed in ghosts. Or, at least, that's what I told myself. Growing up in St. Augustine, Florida, one of the oldest cities in America, meant being surrounded by ghost stories. Every corner had a tale. Every historic building whispered of hauntings. Tourists flocked to the Castillo de San Marcos, claiming they saw figures in colonial uniforms walking the fortress walls. The Huguenot cemetery was said to be haunted by the spirits of yellow fever victims, their silhouettes appearing under the street lamps at night. Even the old lighthouse had its stories, children laughing where no children should be. But those were just stories. At least, that's what I told myself until the night I heard the wailing. It started about 2 weeks ago. I lived in a small, third-floor apartment near the historic district, just a few blocks from the Cathedral Basilica of St. Augustine. The church had been there for centuries, a towering structure of Spanish architecture, its stained glass windows glowing at dusk like captured fire. I passed it almost every day on my way to work, but I never paid it much attention. Then, one night, just as I was drifting to sleep, I heard the sound. A low, distant wail. At first, I thought it was the wind, the way it sometimes howled through the palm trees, bending the branches until they scraped against windows. But this was different. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't the sound of shifting leaves or the creak of settling wood. It was crying, long drawn out, pained. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The sound seemed to seep into the walls, pressing against my skull, vibrating in my chest. I grabbed my phone, checking time. 2:47 a.m. I forced myself to move, stepping cautiously toward the window. My apartment overlooked the narrow streets below, where the glow of antique street lamps cast long, eerie shadows. I expected to see someone there, a drunk tourist, maybe, or a lost night wanderer. There was no one, only the empty street. But the sound was coming from somewhere close. Then I saw it. The cathedral doors, massive, wooden, locked after dark, were slightly open. Just a crack. Just enough to see that the darkness inside was too deep, swallowing what little light reached it. I should have turned away. I should have shut my window, put in my earbuds, and forced myself to sleep. But something pulled at me, an undeniable tug in my chest. I had to know. I threw on my jacket, grabbed my keys, and made my way down the creaking stairs of my building. The air outside was heavy, thick with humidity. My footsteps felt too loud against the cobblestones as I approached the church. The doors were still ajar. I hesitated. Something about the way they stood open, inviting yet unnatural, made my stomach twist. But before I could talk myself out of it, the wailing returned, louder this time, curling through the air like smoke. I stepped inside. The church smelled like candle wax and old wood, the kind of scent that settles deep into your lungs. My shoes echoed against the stone floor, the sound bouncing off the vaulted ceilings, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the sanctuary. The pews were empty. The altar, bathed in the glow of flickering votive candles, stood solemn and untouched. But the sound wasn't coming from here. It was coming from below. I turned toward the side door, the one that led to the church basement. It was slightly open. A cold breath of air whispered up from the darkness beyond, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle, pushing the door open wider. The hinges groaned, the sound almost human in its protest. A stone staircase stretched downward, disappearing into the blackness. I took a step forward, then another. The air grew colder with every step I took. My breath came out in uneven bursts, my heart hammering against my ribs. My phone flashlight barely cut through the dark, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Then the walls changed. What had been simple stone turned into something older, rougher, carved rock, etched with strange, twisting symbols that my eyes couldn't quite follow. They seemed to shift in the dim light, their meaning just out of reach. My foot hit the final step. I had reached the basement. The space was larger than I expected, stretching far beyond the boundaries of the church above. The air was thick, unmoving, as if I had stepped into a place forgotten by time. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room stood a door. It was different from the rest of the basement, made of rusted iron, bolted shut with thick chains. Scratched into its surface were deep gouges, as if something had tried, desperately, to get out. And from behind it, the wailing grew louder. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to leave, to turn back and pretend I had never been here. But I stepped closer. Something shifted in the darkness. At first, I thought it was my shadow, distorted by the dim light of my phone. But then it moved against the light, stretching unnaturally along the stone floor. I froze. A breath, low, ragged, whispered against my ear. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting wildly. There was nothing, no one, but I wasn't alone. A flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. My pulse stuttered. I turned my flashlight toward the door again, and something stood behind it. A figure. Its outline was blurred, like a smudge in reality. But I could see its eyes, dark, hollow pits that seemed to pull the light into them. The chains rattled. I took a step back. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest like an unseen hand. The wailing turned into whispering, 1,000 voices layered over each other, forming words I couldn't understand. Then the whispering stopped, and the door moved. Not much, just an inch, just enough for the chains to go taut, straining against whatever was behind them. A dry, scraping sound echoed in the silence. Then a single word, spoken in a voice that didn't belong to any living thing. Leave. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, sprinting up the stairs 2 at a time, my breath ragged, my skin crawling. The whispers followed me, growing louder, angrier. I slammed through the basement door and into the sanctuary, nearly tripping as I stumbled toward the exit. I burst into the night air, gulping in breath after breath. The church loomed behind me, dark and silent. The wailing was gone, but as I turned toward my apartment, my heart still hammering, a terrible realization settled over me. Something had followed me, something that knew my name. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment, staring at the door, listening, waiting. The city outside was silent, the distant hum of passing cars barely registering over the blood pounding in my ears. Every shadow in my room felt wrong. Every creak of the building a reminder that I had brought something back with me. I wanted to tell myself it was my imagination, that fear had burrowed too deep into my bones, twisting the ordinary into something sinister. But deep down I knew something had followed me home from the church, something that had whispered my name. It started just past 3 a.m. A knock, soft, almost hesitant. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My phone sat in my lap, my fingers gripping it tightly. I wanted to check the peephole to see who was there, but my body refused to move. Another knock. A slow, deliberate pattern. My chest tightened. I knew in my bones, that whoever was standing on the other side of that door wasn't human. Then came the whisper, soft just like before, a voice that seemed to crawl along the walls, sinking into the very air around me. You saw the door. My blood turned to ice. You weren't supposed to see the door. I clenched my teeth, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles ached. The whispering stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. My ears rang from the absence of sound. My body screamed at me to move, to run, but I was paralyzed. Then tap, tap, tap. Not on the door. On my window. 3rd floor. I swallowed a choked breath, slowly turning my head toward the glass. At first, I saw nothing. The city lights cast long shadows across my room, illuminating the condensation on the window pane. But as I squinted into the reflection, I realized the condensation was breathing, a slow fogging, then a steady fade, as if something on the other side was exhaling against the glass. I bolted, ripping open my bedroom door. I stumbled into the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet. My hands fumbled for the lock on the front door, my fingers numb and shaking as I twisted the deadbolt. I yanked the door open and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the church. It loomed in front of me, silent and dark, its bell tower stretching toward the sky like an accusing finger. The front doors were locked this time, just as they should have been. I pounded against them, my breath ragged. "Father Matthews!" I gasped. "Open the door. Please." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, I heard the heavy scrape of a bolt unlocking. The door creaked open just enough for an old, weathered face to peer out. Father Matthews. He was in his 70s, his hair a stark white, his eyes sharp despite the deep lines of age carved into his face. "Elliot," he rasped, frowning. "What are you doing here?" I pushed my way inside, slamming the door shut behind me. Something followed me home. His expression darkened. "You went down there." The weight in his voice made my stomach twist. He already knew. I stared at him, my chest still heaving from sprint. "What the hell is down there?" Father Matthews didn't answer immediately. He just sighed, rubbing a tired hand over his face before motioning for me to follow. "This way." I hesitated, but I didn't have another choice. We walked down the main aisle of the church, our footsteps echoing against the stone walls. He led me toward a small wooden door at the back of the sanctuary, the entrance to his office. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old paper and candle wax. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents dusty and well-worn. A single, flickering lamp cast shadows along the wooden desk, making the entire room feel smaller than it was. Father Matthews sat down heavily in the chair behind his desk. He gestured for me to sit across from him, but I remained standing. "I need answers," I said. "Now." He studied me for a long moment before nodding. "The basement. It wasn't always part of this church." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" He exhaled. "Before the church was built, before this city even had streets, there was something else here. Something buried." He paused, his fingers drumming against the wooden surface. "The foundation of this church was built on top of something much older, a crypt." I felt the blood drain from my face. "We don't know exactly who built it," he continued. "The records don't exist. Some say it belonged to a forgotten sect. Others believe it was part of a lost settlement long before the Spanish arrived. But one thing is clear." He looked up, his eyes dark. Whatever they locked away down there, they never meant for it to be found. A chill slithered down my spine. But someone did find it. Yes. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. Over 100 years ago, when the church was undergoing renovations, the workers broke through the old foundation. That's when they found the iron door. I swallowed hard. They tried to open it, he said. They thought it was just an old storage chamber. But when they cut the chains, he shook his head. The wailing started. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air pressing against me like unseen hands. They sealed it again, he continued. But it was too late. The door had been disturbed, and ever since, it calls to people, draws them in. I could barely breathe. Father Matthews looked at me grimly. And you heard it, didn't you? I nodded slowly. He let out a long breath, rubbing his temples. Then it knows you now. I felt sick. What do I do? I whispered. For the first time since I had entered his office, Father Matthews hesitated, and that hesitation terrified me. There might be a way to sever the connection, he said finally, but you have to act quickly. Ow! He stood, moving toward one of the bookshelves. His fingers traced along the spines until he found what he was looking for, an ancient, leather-bound tome. He flipped through the brittle pages before stopping on one in particular. You have to go back, he said. Back to the basement. My stomach dropped. No. I shook my head. Hell no. He looked at me, his expression grave. If you don't, it will follow you. It will never stop. A deep, crawling dread settled into my bones. I had barely survived one night. Now I had to go back. I didn't want to go back. Every part of me screamed to run, to leave the city and never return. But deep down, I knew Father Matthews was right. If I didn't face whatever was down there, it would follow me forever. And it was getting closer. After leaving the church that morning, I had tried to pretend it was over, that the whispers, the knocking, the unseen presence watching me from the corners of my room had all been some elaborate trick of my mind. But the signs were everywhere. The air in my apartment felt wrong, heavy, as if it belonged to another place entirely. The floorboards creaked when I wasn't walking. My phone screen glitched, displaying unreadable symbols before crashing entirely. And the whispers never stopped. By the time the sun had set, I knew what I had to do. I had to go back to the basement. I arrived at the church just before midnight. The city streets were eerily quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The front doors were already unlocked. I pushed them open, stepping into the darkened sanctuary. Candles flickered near the altar, their light barely illuminating the vast emptiness of the church. Father Matthews was waiting for me. He stood near the pulpit, a lantern in one hand, a leather-bound book in the other. His face was grim, his usual warmth replaced by something colder, something that told me he wasn't sure I would make it back. "Are you ready?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "No." He nodded. "Good. If you were, you wouldn't understand the danger." Without another word, he turned and led me toward the back of the church, past rows of pews that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. The wooden door to the basement loomed ahead, its surface scarred and ancient. My pulse pounded in my ears. "Once we go down," Father Matthews said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's no turning back." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to run. But something deep inside me, a horrible, gnawing curiosity, refused to let me leave. "Let's do this," I said. He nodded, then pushed the door open. The air changed the moment we stepped inside. It was colder than before, unnaturally so. My breath came out in visible puffs, the chill wrapping around me like unseen fingers. The narrow staircase stretched downward, vanishing into absolute blackness. Father Matthews raised the lantern, casting flickering light across the stone walls. The deeper we went, the more I noticed something disturbing. The walls weren't just stone. They were carved. Strange, intricate symbols ran along the surface, etched deep into the rock as if someone or something had spent centuries engraving them. They weren't just random scratches. They meant something. I reached out, running my fingers along one of the carvings. The moment my skin touched the stone, a whisper slid into my ear. "Elliot." I yanked my hand back. Father Matthews glanced at me, but said nothing. He just kept moving, his grip tightening on the lantern. We reached the bottom of the staircase. A long, narrow corridor stretched ahead, its ceiling low enough that I had to duck slightly. The air smelled damp like rotting wood and something else, something metallic. Blood. My stomach churned. At the end of the corridor stood the iron door. It was taller than I remembered, its surface rusted and covered in more of the strange carvings. Heavy chains wrapped around it, secured by an ancient-looking padlock. And then I noticed it. The door was breathing. A slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, as if something massive was behind it, pressing against the metal from the other side. "We don't have much time," Father Matthews said. I forced myself to look away from the door. "What do we do?" He knelt, placing the book on the floor and flipping it open. "I'm going to recite a passage that should sever the connection between you and it. But you need to listen carefully." I nodded, my hand shaking. "No matter what you hear," he continued, "no matter what you see, do not touch the door." I swallowed hard. "Got it." He exhaled, then began to read. The language was old, ancient. The words felt wrong in my ears, as if they didn't belong in the world of the living. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. And then the wailing started. It wasn't human. The sound that emerged from behind the door was layered, dozens, no, hundreds of voices merging into one. It rose and fell, a cacophony of agony, anger, hunger. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still. The wailing turned into whispers. "Elliot, come closer." My knees felt weak. My mind screamed at me to back away, but my body, my very soul, was being pulled forward. The door was calling me, and then a single, bony hand slipped through the gap in the iron. My breath caught. The fingers were long, impossibly thin, the skin stretched tight over jagged bone. The nails were cracked, yellowed, curling at the tips. It reached for me. I took a step back, then another. But the hand followed, extending farther than it should have been able to. Father Matthew's voice grew louder, his chanting more urgent. The wailing turned into a scream. A second hand emerged, then an eye. A milky, white orb peeked through the gap, staring directly at me. My stomach lurched, ball rising in my throat. The door should not have had a gap. The chains were still in place. The padlock was unbroken, but something was pushing through. The whispers became deafening. "Let me out. I remember you. You saw the door." The hands clawed at the metal, pulling, prying. The iron groaned under the pressure, warping slightly. The eye blinked. A mouth appeared. It stretched wide, too wide, revealing rows of shattered, jagged teeth. A thin, black tongue slithered from between them, tasting the air. Father Matthews suddenly slammed his hand down on the book. The lantern flickered, then exploded into a burst of white light. The wailing turned into a shriek. The hands withdrew. The eye vanished. And then silence. The heaviness in the air disappeared. The iron door stopped breathing. The carvings on the walls seemed to dim, as if losing whatever power had been coursing through them. Father Matthews slowly exhaled. "It's done," he whispered. I didn't move. I barely breathed. It felt like hours before I found my voice. "Is it gone?" Father Matthews hesitated. Then he looked at me. "No," he said, "but for now it's trapped." I swallowed hard. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small vial of dark liquid. "This is consecrated oil. Take it. Pour it along every doorway of your home. It won't stop it forever, but it will slow it down." I took the vial with shaking hands. "We need to leave," he said, "before it wakes up again." I nodded. As we climbed the stairs, leaving the basement behind, I had the sickening feeling that this wasn't over. The door hadn't been locked to keep us out. It had been locked to keep something else in. And now it knew me. I didn't sleep that night. Even after leaving the church, even after following Father Matthew's instructions to the letter, sealing every door in my apartment with the consecrated oil, I still felt watched. The whispers had stopped. The air had lost that crushing, unnatural weight. But something inside me knew it wasn't over. I sat on my couch. Every light in my apartment turned on, the vial of oil clutched in my trembling hand. My mind replayed the moment in the basement over and over, the way the thing behind the door had reached for me, how it had known my name. And the worst part? I could still hear it. Not the wailing, not the whispers, something deeper. A presence that had buried itself inside my skull, waiting. Something had followed me home. At first it was small, a faint scratching noise just beyond my bedroom door. I sat up straight, my pulse hammering. My first thought was mice. Maybe a rat had gotten in. But as I listened, I realized something horrifying. It wasn't random. It was writing, a slow, deliberate carving sound dragging along the wood. I stood slowly, heart pounding, and stepped toward the door. The air grew thick, pressing against my skin. My breath came out shallow and uneven. The scratching stopped. I hesitated, hand hovering near the doorknob. Then 3 loud knocks. I stumbled back. The knocks weren't from the hallway. They were inside the room. My blood ran cold. I had been in my apartment alone for hours. I had sealed every doorway. Nothing could have gotten in. Unless. I turned, grabbed my phone, and called Father Matthews. He answered almost instantly. "Elliot, there's something here," I whispered. "Inside my apartment." Silence on the other end. Then, "Do not open the door." I swallowed hard, staring at the wood. It already knocked. Father Matthews let out a shaky breath. "Listen to me. The door in the basement wasn't just locked, it was sealed. For centuries. When we disturbed it, we let something out." I squeezed my eyes shut. "So what do?" A long pause. Then, "You have to go back." The city felt different that night. The streets were empty, the traffic lights blinking on deserted intersections. A thick fog had settled over the sidewalks, swallowing entire buildings in its pale grip. I drove in silence, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had tried to avoid looking at my rearview mirror, because every time I did, I swore I saw something sitting in the back seat. The church loomed ahead, its towering structure barely visible through the fog. The front doors were unlocked. again. I pushed them open, stepping into the vast, darkened sanctuary. Father Matthews was already waiting near the pulpit, a thick book in his hands. His face was pale, his expression grim. "You're sure it followed you?" he asked. I nodded. "I heard it. Inside my apartment." He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Then we don't have much time." I hesitated. "What is it?" Father Matthews glanced toward the back of the church, where the basement door waited in the shadows. "A remnant," he said quietly, "a soul that never passed on. It's been trapped beneath this church for centuries, waiting for something or someone to call to it." I felt sick. "You think I called to it?" Father Matthews didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward the basement door. The air was wrong. The moment we stepped inside, the cold wrapped around us like a suffocating grip. The narrow staircase stretched downward, the flickering lantern casting long, shifting shadows along the stone walls. The carvings were different now. The strange symbols that had once lined the walls had changed. They were deeper, sharper, fresh, as if something had been etching them while we were gone. And then I noticed the door. The iron surface was bulging outward. Something was pressing against it from the other side, its shape distorting the metal. Long, skeletal fingers clawed from beneath the gap at the bottom, scraping against the floor. And worst of all, it was unlocked. The chains lay in a heap beside it, the padlock shattered. The air pulsed, the low hum of something alive vibrating through the walls. Father Matthews inhaled sharply. "We're too late." The wailing began again. The sound wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was 100 voices shrieking at once, an endless chorus of agony and rage. And then the door swung open. A flood of blackness spilled into the room, an unnatural darkness that swallowed the lantern's glow. A shape slithered forward, tall and wrong. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending in ways that defied logic. And its face, it didn't have one. Just a smooth, featureless expanse where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. But somehow, I knew it was looking at me. It knew me. The whispers returned, louder than ever. "You called me." I stumbled back, my entire body trembling. Father Matthews raised his book, chanting in a voice that shook with fear. The air pulsed, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly. The thing laughed, a deep guttural sound that made my skin crawl. Father Matthews' chanting grew desperate. The thing lunged, and then everything went black. I woke up lying on the cold stone floor. The air was silent. The iron door was closed again, the chains wrapped tightly around it. The carvings had faded, as if they had never been touched. Father Matthews knelt beside me, his face lined with exhaustion. "You're alive." I sat up slowly, my head pounding. "What happened?" "We sealed it." "Barely." His voice was weak. "It nearly got out, Elliot." I swallowed hard. "But it didn't." He nodded, but his expression remained dark. "No, but it's awake now." A deep, unshakable dread settled into my bones. Somehow, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I wasn't sure how long I lay on the cold stone floor of the church basement, but when I came to, the air was still heavy with something unnatural. The iron door was sealed shut again, the chains wrapped tightly around it. The carvings had dulled, their eerie glow extinguished, but the feeling remained. It was still there, waiting. Father Matthews sat against the wall, his hands gripping his rosary so tightly his knuckles were white. He was pale, drained, as if something had taken a part of him and refused to give it back. "We sealed it," he murmured, barely loud enough to hear. "For now." I swallowed, my throat dry. "What was that?" His eyes flickered to mine, haunted, something that should have never been disturbed. I pushed myself upright, my body aching from whatever had happened. The last thing I remembered was that thing lunging, its faceless void aimed right at me. And then, nothing. But I knew, deep down, that it hadn't left me. It knew me now. Father Matthews drove me home that night. I didn't argue. I wasn't in any shape to be behind the wheel. The streets were empty, swallowed by thick fog that rolled like smoke through the city. The street lights flickered strangely as we passed, their glow struggling against the darkness. Neither of us spoke until we reached my apartment building. "This isn't over, is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Father Matthews turned to me, his face lined with exhaustion. "No, but you need to be careful. Whatever was in that basement, it saw you. It knows you now." A shiver crawled up my spine. "You have to act as if it's still watching," he continued. "Because it is." I hesitated at the door, staring up at the dimly lit hallway leading to my apartment. The weight of his words pressed down on me. "And if it tries to come back?" His expression darkened. "Pray it doesn't." I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Because the moment I entered, I felt it. Something was wrong. It started with whispers, faint at first, just at the edge of my hearing. I turned on every light, my hands shaking. I knew I was alone. I had checked every room twice. But no matter where I stood, the sensation lingered, like someone was right behind me. The whispering grew clearer. I pressed my back against the wall, my pulse hammering. The words weren't gibberish anymore. They were my own name. Elliot. The sound came from my bedroom. I didn't want to go in. Every part of me screamed to run. But I had to see. I stepped forward, inch by inch, until I reached the doorway. The room was empty, exactly as I had left it. But then I noticed something wrong. The mirror above my dresser. It had been written on. I stepped closer, my stomach twisting. The words had been scratched into the glass from the inside. "You let me out." A cold sweat broke out across my skin. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, and that's when I heard it, a faint click. The door to my apartment had unlocked itself. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The door creaked open on its own, inch by inch, the hallway outside yawning like an open mouth. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. And then I saw them. At first, they were just shadows in the hallway. But then they moved. Tall, twisted figures. Limbs too long. Faces missing. They stood there unmoving, watching. Then they stepped inside. I scrambled backward, my mind screaming at me to run. But my body refused to listen. My legs felt like lead, my breath caught in my throat. The whispering grew deafening. They took another step, and another. They were in my living room now. One of them raised a hand and pointed at me. "You let me out." I choked on a sob, pressing my hands over my ears. This couldn't be happening. I had left that thing behind. Hadn't I? Then I saw the door. Not my front door. Not my bedroom door. The door from the church basement. It was standing right there, in the middle of my living room. The iron surface, the deep carvings, the shattered lock. The figures didn't walk toward me. They walked into the door, one by one, slipping inside the darkness beyond it. And then the door slammed shut, and it was gone. I barely remember calling Father Matthews. I must have been sobbing because his voice was urgent, demanding to know what had happened. I told him everything. The mirror, the whispering, the door appearing in my apartment. His voice was firm. "Elliot, you need to come back to the church. Now." I didn't ask why. I already knew. Whatever we had locked away in that basement wasn't done with me. I arrived at the church in the dead of night. The doors were already open. I stepped inside, the silence pressing against me like a thick fog. Father Matthews was waiting by the pulpit, but he wasn't alone. 3 other priests stood with him, all solemn, all watching me with grim expressions. "You saw the door, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I nodded, my throat dry. "Then it means one thing." He turned toward the back of the church, where the stairs led down into the basement. "The seal is breaking." We made our way down the stairs in silence. The air was thick, suffocating. The carvings had changed again, deeper and more erratic, like something had clawed at the walls. And then we reached the door. The chains were still there, but the iron surface, it was bending, bulging outward. Something was pushing from the other side. A deep, guttural whisper rattled through the basement. "Elliot." The priests began their chanting, their voices steady but urgent. Father Matthews motioned for me to step back. I did, but the whispering only grew stronger. "You let me out." The iron groaned. The chains rattled. The air itself seemed to bend, the light flickering violently. And then the door began to open. The priests' voices rose in desperate chants. Father Matthews threw something salt, holy water, at the iron, but it only delayed the inevitable. The door kept opening. A hand, long and skeletal, pushed through the gap. More chanting, more frantic movement. The chains rattled violently. And then the whispering stopped. A single moment of dead, suffocating silence. Then the door slammed shut. The basement shook. The carvings flickered, and then everything went still. The priests sagged, their voices hoarse. Father Matthews turned to me, his face drenched in sweat. "It wanted you." My stomach turned. "But we forced it back," he continued. "For now." I swallowed hard. "And if it comes back?" Father Matthews' expression darkened. "It will." I turned to the door, the twisted carvings glowing faintly once more. Somehow I knew this was only the beginning.